Yes, this is the first video in the series. If you've been on the internet for any decent amount of time, chances are you know what RPG Maker is. It's a piece of software that's allowed countless amateur developers to create their own video games. After being around for decades, and with more and more RPG Maker games being successful enough to be sold as professional products or even creating entire franchises, chances are that you've played or at least have been exposed to RPG Maker in some way. There's even plenty of people who might consider themselves RPG Maker fans, or experts who know all about the best RPG Maker games out there. But despite the raging notoriety of the engine and how much discourse I see daily regarding RPG Maker games, one thing that's bothered me is the complete lack of information online about one of the biggest and longest running RPG Maker series out there. Despite having over 15 games to its name, almost 2 decades of continued development, and easily having some of the best RPG Maker games of all time under its belt, this series has remained criminally obscure. Even in the rare cases I see it get brought up, it's often told just in passing, as if many of those who know about it only know it by name. Not only that, but misinformation about the series is strife, and I found more often than not people describing it in ways that make it clear that they haven't actually played the games. All that has encouraged me to make this video series where I hope to discuss the entirety of the Towelket One More Time series. Towelket One More Time, or just Towelket, is an extremely obscure and highly underrated Japanese RPG Maker game series. Named after a portmanteau of the words towel and blanket, the series started all the way back in the year 2008 and is still having games developed for it even to this day. Despite the length of the series, most of the games don't have interconnected storylines, meaning that you don't necessarily need to play all the games in order. They do, however, tend to have reoccurring characters, but with no memories from past games, and sometimes even in completely different roles. These games are all made by a single developer, Kanashimi Hochikisu, who is usually just referred to as Kanao. Despite their long history of developing games, very little is actually confirmed about their personal details. This is because Kanao is an extremely eccentric developer, which is a major understatement to say the least. Kanao has a history of constantly changing their online persona, even going as far as to put fake credits for non-existent people in their games. They will make posts online claiming to be a stay-at-home mother at one moment, then a balding single man the next, causing a great amount of confusion. I could probably make an entire video about Kanao's ridiculous online history, but those stories are best to take in over time. For now, just know that Kanao's identity is a bit of a mystery, and if someone confidently states what sort of person Kanao is, then they're probably misled by the countless rumors going around that claim Kanao is one thing or another. So for being such a huge series with a long history and a crazy developer, why is Towelket One More Time so obscure? Surely if the series is as good as this video is building it up to be, and it's such a big series with so many games, then it would have reached internet fame one way or another, right? Plus, RPG Maker games had a huge explosion in popularity right when Towelket started, with some games being so well received that they're still getting attention to this day. Well, I have a few good theories on that. First off, English translations on these games weren't made until many years after release. The first English translation patch was made in 2012, 4 years after the game series started. Not only that, but the translation patch wasn't of the highest quality, which was a major issue since Towelket games are easily more text-heavy than other well-known Japanese RPG Maker games. By the time the series started getting proper English patches, the big RPG Maker popularity boom in the West was basically over. Most people had moved on from exploring new RPG Maker games, and the more notable ones had solidified themselves one way or another. It also didn't help that the first Towelket translation wasn't even for the first game in the series, which brings me to my next point. For some weird reason or another, the Towelket games are purposefully ordered incorrectly. As you may have noticed from the title of this video, the first game in this series is labeled as number 3. The translators had incorrectly translated Towelket 1 instead, which is actually the third game in the series. This, combined with the huge number of games in the series, often results in newcomers becoming overwhelmed or confused on which games they should start with. Like, imagine if you were interested in picking up this RPG series, and not only are you hit with the realization that there's like 20 games, but you also needed to Google a guide just to figure out where to start playing. Just to make things even worse, what if I told you that there wasn't just one Towelket 3, but 3 instead? That's right, there's actually 3 versions of Towelket 3 available, making this whole mess even worse to figure out. There's the original Towelket One More Time 3, Towelket One More Time 3 Karage Tanpopo, and then what would be known unofficially as Towelket One More Time 3 MV. If that wasn't enough, Towelket 2, the second game in the series, actually came out after Classic, but before Karage. This even made coming up with a script for this video a nightmare, but to try and make things clear, this video will mainly be focused on Towelket 3 Karage Tanpopo, as this is the only version of Towelket 3 that has an English translation, and out of the Towelket 3 versions probably makes the most sense to cover. I will go over the other 2 versions of Towelket 3 briefly at the end of this video as well, to go over any notable differences between the games. Lastly, and possibly the biggest hurdle of all, is twofold. Towelket games are often heavily narrative-based, and are clearly written without concerns over typical writing or even video game plot conventions. This means 2 things. You're going to be reading a lot, and what's written can easily end up being disturbing, confusing, or both. Furthermore, there's practically no regard for censorship or age ratings in these games, so the content that can appear in Towelket can be uncomfortable. And no, I don't mean your typical RPG Maker gore or violence. I mean that sometimes the subjects in these games can dive into taboo topics head first, and it's a total dice roll on how the game will treat said subjects. I've seen many cases where someone shows interest in these games, but doesn't get very far before they hit some content that they just aren't comfortable with and give up on the series. Plus, both the amount of text and the content of the text makes it pretty unsuitable for a YouTube format. I've no doubt that I'll have to walk around some eggshells at some point to avoid getting my videos taken down. However, all of this isn't a bad thing, as this unadulterated freedom is also the reason why Towelket games are so unique, and I can truly promise you that even if you feel like video game stories aren't interesting to you or that you've seen everything that video games have to offer, you'll no doubt be blown away by at least one of the Towelket games' stories if you give it the chance. Towelket 3 certainly isn't the best example of what I'm talking about. In fact, it's pretty tame in comparison to later games, but you'll definitely see hints of what I'm getting at here or there. So now, with that out of the way, we can finally talk about Towelket 3, the humble beginnings of this absolutely insane series. Now, personally, I feel like Towelket 3 isn't the best representative for the series as a whole, but still has a lot of unique Towelket charm and creativity. I'll leave my more detailed overall impressions of the game for the end of the video, but for now, let's get started with Towelket 3. The opening cutscene starts by showing us a scene not from the protagonist's point of view, but instead the story's antagonists, the Kisetsu aliens. These aliens are led by 6 fish hats, leaders who wear fish-like hats on their heads. Zuche, the leader of the Kisetsu aliens, makes a speech to his snake-like soldiers that they plan to take over the solar system. However, it ends up that they're 100 times smaller than humans, making their invasion of Earth impossible. To alleviate this, there's a magic book on Earth that contains the power to change the size of whoever uses it, which would allow the Kisetsu to grow large enough to take over the planet. Meanwhile, back on Earth, we start off with the option to pick either a male or a female protagonist. This doesn't change the story dramatically, but it does affect dialogue, mostly with the love interest of the game, Conchel. For this review, we'll be picking the male protagonist, Kachil, or Kachiru. Our story starts off in a humble home out in the middle of nowhere, where our mom starts nagging us to go play with our sister, who's currently in the storage room. Before we do that though, we can loot around for some items that'll no doubt be useful later. This is your first hint that interacting with the environment to find items will be very helpful, if not a little too helpful throughout this series, as we'll learn later. Going into the storage room, we can find our little sister, Kimiru, who's looking for something fun to do in this dusty old storage room. Kimiru, being a young little sister, is a pretty amusing character. Just like you'd expect from a little sister, she's a little bratty at times, and maybe slightly more demonic than she should be, but she still looks up to you all the same as her older sibling. Finding a strange dusty old book, we bring it back to her and open it. And wouldn't you know, it's that magical book the fish hats have been looking for. After a bright light envelops the room, we find ourselves shrunken down to a tiny size, with the entire room looking massive compared to us. We find our sister shrunken next to us, her Towelket nearby on the ground. It ends up that the magical book has shrunken us down, but it somehow ended up flying away during the panic out of our reach. Luckily for us, the owner of the book comes crawling out, a strange talking cat creature who promises to help us use the book to return us to our normal size. However, just at that moment, our own mother comes into the room and decides now is the perfect time to vacuum the storage room. After fading back in, we find ourselves woken up by our sister inside of the vacuum cleaner, with that cat nowhere to be found. It ends up that the insides of the vacuum cleaner is actually home to a place called Dust Town, which due to our mother's cleaning is now infested with horrible dust monsters, which are attacking the innocent population, and we're stuck in the middle of the chaos. Now, I'm sure you've noticed something on screen at this point. I mean, it begs your attention by being the most colorful thing on the screen. Those corpses are probably the first thing you plan on interacting with the moment you get to this screen. You're probably thinking to yourself, oh, those silly RPG Maker games with their pixel art, blood, and gore. That's nothing new. Wow, what a way to introduce your game series 5 minutes in. After you take a moment, you might be thinking that this is intended to be some sort of edgy shock content. Maybe it's to scare or unsettle you as a sort of cute game is actually bloody sort of thing. And honestly, I don't think it's any of that. Normally in a horror game, the characters would scream or react to sort of tell you that this is supposed to be scary. Or maybe, if it was something intended to be edgy, the characters would make some inappropriate comment, but no. These two little kids are just totally neutral about this desecrated corpse and walk away as if nothing's wrong. It's played completely straight, and you just have to accept that it's there. With that out of the way, we can explore the Dust Town village, making this the very first vacuum cleaner level in any video game, if not the only one as far as I know. The town is pretty basic as far as RPG towns go, but being inside of a vacuum cleaner definitely scores it some originality points. Talking around, we learn that the bag we're currently in is going to fill up with dust and eventually be thrown into an incinerator, killing everyone inside. There might be a way to escape, but there's a horrible dust monster that's killed everyone that's tried to escape so far. Before we can leave, we'll need to level up a bit, stock up on items, and duel the Dust Village Chief to prove that we can beat up the dust monster, introducing us to combat. So first off, I want to get this out of the way. A lot of popular RPG Maker games tend to give combat a backseat, with some of the most popular RPG Maker games having no combat at all. Often nowadays, this results in these games being given the somewhat derogatory term, walking simulator. This sometimes results in people assuming Towelket is the same, and while some of the later games certainly have a shortage of combat, Towelket 3 is not one of those games. There's lots of mandatory encounters, and while there's no random encounters, some of the enemy variety in this game is interesting enough that it's fun to do some fighting anyways. In all of the Towelket games, enemies are represented as NPCs on the map. Sometimes these NPCs will chase you, but a majority of the time they tend to just wander randomly. This is pretty nice, as it lets you avoid encounters fairly easily, but it's still pretty easy to get into combat if you're careless. Combat in Towelket 3 is pretty easy to understand, but it's got a bit more under the hood than you might expect. The game has a heavy focus on elemental weaknesses, status effects, and stat buffs, and your ability to play around these will make a big difference between whether this game's combat is a slog or a breeze. Pretty much every piece of equipment you can get has at least one element associated with it, with many later game ones having multiple. Equipping these will reduce the amount of damage you take from those elements and can turn a party-wiping attack into something you can just shrug off. A big part of the fun in this game is the huge variety of equipment and trying to distribute it effectively around your party. What makes the equipment collecting more enjoyable is that a lot of the equipment is really ridiculous too. Your party will start off fighting with pieces of timber and scissors, but then eventually start fighting using fire hydrants and telephone poles. Buffs and debuffs are also extremely strong in these games, because the stat changes only wear off once the battle ends. Not only that, but the stat gains are incredibly impactful. It's completely possible for you to buff your own defense to the point where enemies can't even hurt you anymore, and unless if the enemy has a defense debuff move, you win. The only limiting factor is that there's a cap to how much you can buff yourself, as buff skills are too expensive to spam in the early game, but even just a couple buffs can make you feel overpowered. Lastly are status effects, and now status effects are king in the early Towelket games. Have you ever heard of people complaining about status effects being useless in other RPGs? Well, here it's the opposite problem. You can basically win fights through status effects alone, and they usually even work on bosses too. Poison just shreds through boss HP, and it's possible to disable bosses with status effects so you can wail on them. To make it even easier, the game gladly sells you cheap bomb items that let you spam status effects on the whole enemy party. The only thing that makes it fair is that early status effects are a bit unreliable to land. Also, enemies will gladly use status effect moves on you too. And if there's anything that will make you game over, it'll probably be getting unlucky and getting stun locked to death. Now, I actually kind of like this combat because it encourages you to go out of your way to set up on the opponent. Too many RPG games nowadays, even full-priced modern big-budget RPGs, are more than happy to just have combat that boils down to spamming your strongest attack over and over and just healing when needed. A lot of RPG Maker games, especially, have an issue with throwing in combat that's so one-dimensional, it feels kind of pointless. In comparison, it's fun to have an RPG where setting up is so rewarding for once. However, here's the thing. The combat in Towelket 3 isn't very hard, even if you ignore everything I just said. It just becomes tedious. Healing items are super easy to get, and most bosses don't have particularly damaging or dangerous attacks, but big life pools. This means that if you aren't very good at RPG games, you'll be able to win, sure, but it'll take you so long that you might find the combat really boring. Personally, I think it's good that the combat is forgiving enough that inexperienced players can win, while still rewarding good play with faster fights. But I could see how Towelket 3 could come off as too grindy or tedious if you aren't exploiting all the systems the game has to offer. Anyhow, beating the Dust Chief is simple, as you don't have much at this point other than to mash attack and maybe heal if needed. Once we beat him, he gives us permission to leave Dust Village, and to try and escape the vacuum cleaner bag before it gets thrown away. He even joins our group as a party member to help us. What a great guy. As we leave the village, the screen fades to black, and we're brought to the perspective of the second protagonist of the story, Cont. She's a 13-year-old girl with an entire gym's worth of equipment in her house and a fiery attitude. She takes the role of the love interest in this game, but also carries the story forward and has a lot to do with the main plot. Depending on your character's gender, her personality towards them will be fairly different. If you're a boy, she'll have a tsundere attitude of sorts, but if you're a girl, she'll be a bit more forthcoming. It seems like the magic of the book reached her too, as she's shrunken down just like us. When she finally comes to, she's surrounded by a bunch of strange white and black bear things called the pawns, who love making the sound doo-doo-doo. They say that she's been selected to become their princess and to ask her to come with them. Clearly sensing that she shouldn't trust these things, she fights back, but gets overwhelmed and knocked out. Once the screen fades in, we see... Oh my god, what is this place? I've only known Cont for 30 seconds, and I already have secondhand fear for my life. There's statues worshipping her, some sort of robotic doll of her dressed up in a wedding outfit, and I don't even know what the hell is going on up there. This is the room of the infamous Pawn Groom, the leader of the pawns, who really likes Cont. Normally he was too tiny to interact with Cont, just watching and spying on her like a pervert. But now that she's shrunken down, he finally has a chance to force her to marry him. Just before he can do anything too strange though, Cont starts to wake up. Pawn Groom says that she should get married to him, and as you'd expect, Cont responds to his offer by bashing him over the head. This section of the game is short, but goes beyond words. It's basically an entire area dedicated to playing as a little girl surrounded by the extremely creepy and perverted fantasies of Pawn Groom. Pretty much everything you read or interact with is absolutely hilarious. You can even pick up Pawn Groom's diaries, which give you extra cutscenes where he goes into great detail about things like wanting to drink Conchell's bathwater or sleeping between her sweaty thighs. I wish I could read everything to you, but then this video would be even longer than it already is. So I'll just leave you with this one bit of dialogue. Now, the idea of a sketchy age gap relationship isn't an uncommon trope, especially in Japan, but I don't think I've ever seen a game just outright spell it out like that. And in a room with these things everywhere. Now, for the 2% of viewers who didn't already click out of the video in disgust, I hope that you like this humor, because there's lots more where that came from in Towelket 3. The game constantly hits you with this humor, and your enjoyment of this game is probably going to be affected heavily by how funny you think it is. After getting over any mental trauma you may have sustained as a player, it's a pretty quick walk to the exit, with just a few fights against some pawns on the way. Unfortunately for Conchell, though, she's ambushed once again by a horde of pawn upon trying to leave, and she gets kidnapped again, sending us back to Kachil and his sister. Now, I want you to imagine a horrible, gruesome scene before you. Hundreds of corpses lay across the ground, violated in horrific, unimaginable ways. The pained screams of countless dust villagers ring out throughout the air as entire families are torn apart, hung from hooks and splattered across the entire map. What sort of music do you think would play to accentuate such an area? Maybe some sort of horror music track, or creepy ambience. Maybe the screams of the damned, or maybe... I couldn't make something like this up. The first time I realized that the goddamn pizza music was playing on this map, something in me just broke. I think I spent the next 10 minutes laughing my ass off. Why is the funny Italian music playing when you're surrounded by mangled corpses? I have no idea, it just is. I suppose now is as good of a time as any to talk about the music, now that we're this far in. The soundtrack to Towelket games is entirely comprised of public domain or royalty-free music, with Towelket 3's entire soundtrack consisting of MIDI songs. Now, I know that doesn't sound very impressive on paper, but the way the music is used is very unique and iconic for the Towelket series. A large portion of the music is played using music box-like instrumentation, and many of the songs are famous classical musical tracks. It gives the games a childlike yet nostalgic vibe, as you'll no doubt hear at least a few recognizable songs with the dreamy qualities of the MIDI instrumentation. There's also some royalty-free music which you might recognize in other RPG Maker games, but is often used well when classical music just wouldn't set the right tone for a scene. Now, I can't praise Canal themselves for creating the music, otherwise Mozart is going to roll out of his grave and DMCA me, but I could certainly praise Canal for implementing the music in a way that really enhances the tone of the game. Depending on the game, you can often tell that Canal went to a lot of trouble to go through their music library and pick the perfect song to match the scene at hand, whether it be a gut-busting hilarious scene or a depressing tragedy. However, there's also Towelket 3, where you'll get Italian pizza music in an active war zone, but hey, stuff like that just makes Towelket 3 even more hilarious in my opinion. Okay, with all that out of the way, it's time to focus on the game. Going through the dust dungeon, we find our way is blocked by a bunch of dust, so we need to go in deeper and find the escape scissors. The escape scissors are guarded by the dust monster, some horrible freak made out of the corpses of a bunch of dust villagers. If you don't have the dust chief in your party, he can actually be pretty troublesome. He can charge up into a stronger attack that you're meant to guard, but he can also put your party members to sleep. If he puts someone to sleep and then targets them with the charge attack, it's pretty easy to lose a party member here. I actually got my whole party put to sleep, and then the Dust Chief took double his life in a single hit, killing him instantly. Not only that, but you don't even have access to revive items at this point in the game, so he's just screwed. You don't have much in terms of strategy at this point either, so just beat him down, defend when he charges up, and hope he doesn't nuke a sleeping person until he's dead. After that, you can go back to the Dust Blockade and use the scissors to escape. You can also return back to the Dust Town where everyone thanks you and your smug sister takes all the credit. Sadly, once you escape the vacuum bag, you'll find that your mom has already thrown out the bag with the garbage, and now you're in a garbage dump full of rotting vegetables. Doesn't really sound like a pleasant area, but the town is actually kinda cozy. The little vegetable guys are kinda cute, and I love how the garbage bags have been repurposed into buildings. Apparently, these veggies are all the poor vegetables that didn't get eaten by kids, and the floating ones are ascending to heaven from rotting. They look pretty peaceful about it. Kinda morbid, really. Oh, and you can fight them as enemies if you interact with them. There's also lots of mushrooms on the ground that you can pick up as free healing items too. To get out of the garbage dump, we'll first need to talk to the rat captain for a boat ride through the sewers, but the sewers are poisonous, so he won't let us through until we get some gas masks from the store first. Funnily enough, you can actually unequip the gas masks while in the sewers afterwards, and your health will melt away insanely fast, so that's good attention to detail. The rat captain also joins us as another helper character, and we'll want him for the boss fight on the boat. The boat gets attacked by some strange big-headed lizard creature that we'll learn is called Umebuta-kun. He's got some party-wide moves, but he's nothing too hard. Unfortunately, Umebuta-kun damages the boat during the fight, forcing us to dock in the nearby sewer town for the night while the boat gets repaired. I gotta say, I'm not usually big on sewer levels in games, but I do think the angle taken here was pretty nice. You got buildings made out of trash, there's random junk in the water, and there's a whole variety of NPCs here like the dust villagers we've saved, and vegetable people. There's also those pond guys. It ends up that those pond guys have brought Conchel to Sewer Town to get married, which is probably the worst place you can bring someone for a marriage ceremony. The bouncers won't just let us in, so we have to talk to this ant singer named Pari Pari Ume. We pretend to be a fan of hers to get a signed CD, and we can use it to bribe our way into the wedding. Now, we have no idea who these people are, but of course we're going to crash the wedding and beat up everyone, because that's the right thing to do. The pawn groom is a total pushover and dies easily, letting us save Conchel. Seeing how she's a shrunken human too, she joins the party looking for a way to revert her size as well. Before we leave, don't forget to scoop up some of the dead corpses on the ground, so we can equip them as accessories. Yeah, because why wouldn't the dead pawn bodies be items you can pick up and equip? Stock up on some items and equipment, and then rest at the inn for the boat to repair. While sleeping, we get another perspective from the fish hats. They've captured some poor young boy named Pian who was also shrunken down, deciding to turn him into a mind-controlled minion. They also mention that the pawns are a highly technological race, something you probably wouldn't have guessed from the way they were acting. Once we're brought back to the protagonist view again, the next area is our own home's garden. It's a funny place, where there's lots of insects of both the friendly and hostile variety. There's a friendly ant hill where we can get advice from a queen ant who tells us to get string from the orchestra so we can grapple our way into the house. We thank her by taking her delicious ass. No, really, it's an equipable item and honestly one of the best pieces of equipment in the game, and for some reason the protagonist can't stop thinking about how delicious it is, so make sure you grab that ass and wear it. After grabbing her ass, we beat up the bug orchestra as a boss fight to take their string. There's a lot of enemies in this fight, and if you aren't immediately prepared, they can really pummel your party to death quickly. Any sort of AoEs, especially something like the smoke bomb items to burst them down, will make this fight a lot easier. Once we get the string, we use it to make a rope to climb into our house's window, and inside we find that mysterious white cat again. We learn that its name is Nekoashi Kanbu, but before long the perspective changes. We're brought to the view of Himiola, one of the Fish Hat antagonists, who is in charge of attacking Woodstar, one of the other planets in the solar system along with Earth. What, you don't know about Woodstar? Well, the reason for this joke is that in Japanese, Jupiter's kanji can be read to literally mean wood and star, hence Woodstar. Anyways, we're put in control of Cliché, a sentient woodlog who was woken up by his mother and told that they have to evacuate now, as the planet is under attack by hostile white snakes. First, we'll need to go get our pet dog Pucci. Pucci happens to be a green-haired anime girl who acts like a dog, but I don't think Cliché knows what an anime girl is, so she's just a dog to him. Just as we walk out of the room, however, we find it's too late, and Cliché's poor mother has already been infested by one of the horrible snake creatures. We take her out of her misery, and she begs us to go hide in the nearby barn. After running through a town made of vegetables and swarming with Kisetsu aliens, we find the barn, but it's already been occupied. It looks like all hope is lost until Pucci reveals that she's not just a green-haired anime dog girl, but a robotic green-haired anime dog girl. We get into combat and Pucci fires lasers from her, breasts, which wipes out the Kisetsu aliens. She consumes the Kisetsu aliens, and tells Cliché that they have to escape. Although he has no idea what's going on, he follows her outside and Pucci warps them both to her secret space satellite in orbit. Inside of the satellite, we learn a bit more about Pucci as a character. She was a creation of the Kisetsu aliens who decided to run away, hiding with primitive lifeforms and pretending to be a dog, although she accidentally messed up and can't seem to stop making dog noises. She's a very entertaining and amusing character, and although she clearly knows more than just a dog should, her manner of speech makes her a very memorable and funny character. Cliché is just as confused as we are at what's going on, but with his mother dead and his hometown in ruins, he doesn't have much of a choice. Here, Pucci says that we need to meet with the only similarly sized lifeforms capable of contesting the Kisetsu aliens. If you've been paying attention, then you know who it'll be. Inside of the satellite, we can explore a little bit. We can pick up some lore, and there's some entertaining dialogue, but the real interesting thing is Pucci's bedroom, where something that the Towelket games are a little infamous for is introduced. So you know how I previously mentioned that in combat, if you aren't abusing buffs or status effects to kill your enemies, it can get tedious with how long battles can get? Well, long drawn-out fights aren't too uncommon in RPG games, but they can still be dangerous because they can drain your resources. Even if enemies don't have the ability to wipe out your team easily, they can make you use your limited healing items or mana, and if you run out, then you can game over just from attrition. Knowing how to manage your items is a big part of RPG games, when to use them, how much gold you should spend on consumables, and sometimes even foregoing equipment upgrades for more sustainability in the forms of consumable items, is a staple of RPG gameplay. In Pucci's room, you can find a bath full of Pucci's used bathwater named Pucchi Juice. This juice is a consumable item that heals both health and mana, and you can pick up an infinite amount of it for free. An infinite amount. You can sustain your entire party by drinking an infinite supply of anime dog girl bathwater. This room, as well as some other places in the game, are one of the areas where you can easily pick up an infinite amount of items, and this, as you'd expect, can completely trivialize a lot of the game. Even if you have no idea how to play RPG games, you can just chug your way to victory through the power of Pucchi Juice. And no, it's not a bug either. The drawers nearby can also give you infinite items as well, and they even mention it too. Future Towelket games also do this from time to time as well, although the items you're given and the nature of how the items respawn can vary. Needless to say, the introduction of Pucchi Juice makes the game a lot easier, but honestly, I think it's absolutely hilarious, if not something that makes this game better and more memorable. I think it's actually interesting because it brings into question how RPG games let you stockpile healing items, potentially trivializing a lot of gameplay. The idea of a consumable that you can pick up an infinite amount of sounds broken on paper, but in reality, pretty much every RPG game has infinite healing items. For example, nothing is stopping you from farming items outside of a town and then using the money to buy infinite potions. In fact, healing potions in this game are already absurdly cheap. The only difference here is the convenience, speed, and hilarity of the situation. I mean, think about it. It's not like it sounds fun to stand in one place mashing the Z key, but you're going to do it because you realize how helpful this item is, and how easy it is to get more of it. Then it dawns on you that you're standing here, mashing away so you can have your party live off of a dog girl's bathwater, and now you're not just picking it up because it's helpful, but because it's funny. Before you've even realized it, you've made it a personal goal to collect the max amount of Pucchi Juice, not because you need to, but because you can, and because it's funny. That's the sort of fun you never get from farming enemies for potions. And of course, no one says that you need to stand there farming bathwater until you hit the item cap. You're going to break the game balance on purpose because you find it funny, and you're going to enjoy pouring gallons of Pucchi Juice down Conchell's throat for the rest of the game. Once you've finally satiated your desire for anime dog girl bathwater, it's time to leave the satellite and finally meet up with the rest of the gang back on Earth. While Kachil and everyone are trying to figure out how to get the book back, Pucci crash lands nearby. It's clear that she recognizes Nekoashi Kanbu, and she tells her that the Kasetsu alien invasion is starting, and the pawns are the only hope Earth has. The humans here don't even know who those are, but we're clearly getting swept up into this mess and get brought back to Pawn Town, much to Conchell's dismay. Going back through a much friendlier Pawn Town, we find the pawn groom crying and sulking, hidden away in a secret back room. Although Conchell is at least willing enough to get him to cheer up. Just as we do, though, the Kasetsu aliens attack Pawn Town, forcing us to escape out the back entrance through some extremely questionable rooms. Here we have two choices of a miniature dungeon that we can take. One infested with conch-shell robots, and the other filled with angry cubicle robots called Chibi Robos. You only need to do one to progress, but you can get extra rewards if you do both. Eventually, we reach a ginormous battleship, the secret capital ship of the Pawn Empire, and get on board to escape. However, just as the ship is taking off, our sister Kimiru is pulled away by some Kasetsu aliens. Kachil, as expected, is completely sullen over his sister's likely death, but Conchell tries her best to cheer him up. Conchell promises that Kimiru is surely alive and that everyone will go back to save her. They have a touching moment, and Conchell returns to the others. Unfortunately for her promise, Pawn Groom tells her that it's far too dangerous to go back to Earth as they're outnumbered greatly. He says that they'll need to go to Woodstar first and rescue the woodlings who live there to join forces. Once they have enough people to help, they'll be able to return to Earth and save Kimiru. Unknown to everyone, Kachil is outside the room, eavesdropping on the conversation. Hearing that his sister isn't going to be saved, Kachil decides to hijack a ship and go back to Earth alone to save her. The perspective then goes back to Conchell, who wants to tell Kachil the bad news. She stays outside of the room and tries to apologize, but of course there's no one there now. She takes this as a sign that he's in no mood to fight, and everyone else heads off to Woodstar, leaving us without our protagonist. Before we take on Woodstar, we stop by Pucci Satellite again as our home base, letting us stock up on more items, gear, and the ever-valuable Pucchi Juice. It's a little late at this point, but this is probably as good a time as any for me to mention the mind system that Towelket 3 has. It's a pretty creative concept for an RPG game, and I don't really think any other non-Towelket game has something like this. The mind is a menu option that, at pretty much any time during gameplay, allows you to warp into your character's own mind as a map. Here, you can purchase new skills and magic for your characters, watch some bonus cutscene content, and even rest up and heal. However, what's really interesting is that for every notable event that happens in the game, a new NPC representing that event will appear in the mind. Talking to this NPC will give you a little reminder on what happened and a bonus item or permanent stat boost to commemorate the event. I absolutely love this system. Not only does this work as a synopsis by letting you remember what's happened so far, but it's really interesting seeing these empty rooms fill up over time with all sorts of different characters. It really helps you visualize that this is a journey with lots to remember. Not only that, but the items and stat boosts you can get here are very useful, so it's definitely worth checking out every once in a while to see what new items you get. It's also not directly part of the mind, but Towelket 3 also features a very primitive thing that you could maybe call a skill tree. Well, it's not really a tree, because you can pick any skill at any time, but I commend the effort to make something like this from scratch using RPG Maker 2000. Simply put, you gain skill points over time as you play the game, and you can spend them here to buy skills to give your characters. At this point, you've probably picked up a decent number of skill points, and there are some useful skills you can get to customize your characters from here. The only problem is that it's basically impossible to tell what these skills are until you click on them, but at least they're kind of organized. You can get some of the best abilities in the game here, so once again, it's worth checking out. The single target poison spells, AoE sleep, and magic defense buff skills can all help you out a ton. After doing our preparations, we can leave the satellite and proceed for Woodstar. Before we get there, we get a quick cutscene showing that Kimiru is indeed alive, but captured by the Kisetsu, who are planning on doing experiments with her, which is really the best case we could have hoped for. I wonder how our protagonist is oh, they're dead. Yeah, so our protagonist died off-screen by crashing the spaceship. Talk about an anticlimactic way to go. Their body is found by Pari Pari Ume the ant, and that's all we see of them. Back on Woodstar, things aren't looking too good. There's dead vegetable people everywhere, turned into skewers, salads, and soups. But hey, they're edible. Might as well not let good food go to waste. We fight our way through the ruins of Woodstar and through the Kisetsu's forced labor camp to find Himiola's ship. Pucchi keeps eating all of the Kisetsu aliens on the way there. There's also a convenient warp point outside of the ship to make going back to heal up easier. In the ship, you can see just how terrible of a villain Himiola is. Putting vegetables in pickling jars, logs of cruel experiments, like slicing them up and putting them in stews. Except, these are just ways of cooking vegetables. I never really figured out why the vegetables on Earth are apparently sad that they weren't eaten, but the people on Woodstar are so against it, but I suppose it'd be rude to assume two different planets' populations would have the same views on being eaten. Once you find Himiola, he's probably the trickiest boss fight so far, seeing how you're missing a bunch of your usual characters, and he has status effect moves that can disable your party. Something funny that happened during this recorded playthrough was that I decided to give all of my characters wind scissors to fight with, since it seemed like a pretty good weapon at the time. Unfortunately for me, Himiola is immune to wind damage, so I ended up having to poison him to death. After beating him in battle, Pucchi eats him and his crew, just like all of the other Kisetsu aliens, saving Woodstar from the invaders. We then go to the perspective of Kimiru, who is being held prisoner by the Kisetsu aliens and undergoing torture in a laboratory near Earth. Between sessions of torture, she meets Nekozuken, the first of the robots made by the Kisetsu aliens. He seems like he's given up hope of escaping, but Kimiru, driven by the desire to see her brother again, encourages him to escape with her. After a Kisetsu alien consumes the half of the Towelket she's been left with, she breaks from her restraints and pummels them to a pulp, starting her escape with Nekozuken. As you leave, you'll notice something a little peculiar. All of the enemies here are variants of Pucci. Furthermore, in a room, you can find a human girl being held within a tank, who is clearly the Pucci that we know and love. It's not elaborated on, but there's some clues about the backstories of these characters, and here's my theory. It seems that the Kasetsu aliens created the D-series robots in an attempt to create autonomous combat robots. The first robot was Nekozuken, the first robot with real autonomy. The second robot was Nekoashi Kanbu, who has much greater intelligence than Nekozuken. Nekoashi Kanbu's intelligence was so great that she created the magic book responsible for shrinking down our protagonists. Using this book, the Kasetsu aliens kidnapped a human girl by shrinking her down and used her to create the Pucci robot that we know about. These Pucci robots not only have advanced combat capabilities, but also the ability to warp. The ultimate goal of the Kasetsu aliens is to use the book to enlarge these Pucci robot clones so that they can take over Earth. However, learning that the Kasetsu were performing cruel experiments, the D-series robots were intelligent and autonomous enough to defect from the Kasetsu aliens. Therefore, they tried to escape. Pucci, being capable of warping, was easily able to teleport out, and Nekoashi Kanbu was smart enough to escape on her own, taking the book with her to ensure that the Kasetsu aliens couldn't use it for evil. Nekozuken, unfortunately, wasn't able to escape, and that's why he's trapped here. Now, just one detail I have to bring up because I know someone will point out eventually, but yes, Pucci is called D2, while Nekoashi Kanbu is D3. Despite this, Pucci is the later model. Although I don't want to bring the NV remake into this, in that game Pucci was titled as the D3 robot to make this more clear. The fish hat behind creating the D-series robots is Seller, who impedes our way to escape the ship. Surprisingly, she seems empathetic to Nekozuken, despite torturing him moments ago. She goes down without much of a fight, and even offers him a new cloak, but promises that we'll meet again in the future. We take her keycard and steal a ship to fly out of Seller's laboratory, which thankfully Nekozuken knows how to pilot. Returning back to the Woodstar gang, peace has returned, and the Woodstar people are recovering after the attack. It seems that they can replant the dead souls of those who are lost into new vegetables, which I guess makes sense. They promise to help us fight against the Kasetsu aliens, but when Pucci tries to warp back everyone, she explodes, breaking in the process. Thankfully, Pongrum knows of an acquaintance who specializes in robots who can fix Pucci, so we fly over there to meet him. So you know all those weird conch shell robots from before? Well, it ends up that this is the guy who makes them, and it ends up that the groom isn't the only one who can buy them. You can go through the shops here and buy your very own conch shell dolls. Just look at the variety here. You get the idea. They're expensive, but each one actually appears in the mind, so if you're as big of a pervert as the groom, then you better buy them while you can. I can only assume the unfitting Christmas music is playing to get you in the mood for wasting all of your money on these dumb things. Going through the workshop and reading way too many weird descriptions of fetishes applied to Conchel, we find Poppichi, the pawn who works on the robots. Not only does he promise to fix Pucci, but he also offers his chibi robot helpers, these little square guys, to help us out in the fight against the Kasetsu. What a nice guy. Now, here's an interesting decision that changes the course of the story a bit. It'll take a day for Poppichi to repair Pucci, so you have two choices. You can either stay here for the night while he finishes, or leave early to go to the ship without Pucci. After making your decision, you leave Pongru behind to go back to the pawn battleship. The party meets with Kimiru and Nekozuken's escape pod. However, they're tailed by two Kasetsu fighters. Kachil, Kimiru, Conchel, and even the lovable Dust Chief are all dead. What will happen now? The next segment has you playing as Conchel, and you're woken up in a strange, somewhat dreamlike space. As is made clear very quickly, you're dead, and now a soul that exists in a heaven-like place known as the realm of the Moon Princess. She tasks us with collecting the dead souls of everyone who has died with us, clearly acting as a godlike figure who watches over those who die. This is where that decision we just took in Poppichi's workshop comes into play. If you decide to leave Poppichi's workshop immediately, then Pucchi won't be with you when the ships are destroyed. Pucchi will stay as a robot, as well as gaining either the missile or defense upgrade that you chose. However, if you stay for the night, then Pucchi will join you on the ship, resulting in Pucchi's death along with the rest of the party. If Pucchi dies, you'll find her in the Moon Princess's realm along with everyone else, but she will no longer be the robot Pucchi you know. Instead, she will become reincarnated Pucchi, a floating, bloodied spirit just like the other moon deities within the Moon Princess's realm for the rest of the game. This changes not only how she fights within battles, but it also affects her storyline and dialogue. Whether Pucchi is dead or not, we first find the souls of Kimiru and Kachil, the latter being dead for quite a while at this point. If Pucchi is dead, you can also find the dog and cow, yes, cow, that were also part of her robot form. Progressing ahead, we find that Nekoashi Kanbu and Nekojita have reverted back to these goofy-looking cats, proof that they were originally cats turned into a robot in a similar way to Pucchi. I absolutely love the aesthetic of this place, and this screen in particular is just so soulful. I love the cutesy suns, moons, and star, and the ginormous body smiling at what seems to be an ocean really finishes off the cute and absurd, but also somewhat somber tone of the map. Although we don't see maps like this too often in the series, it's one of the more aesthetically defining moments of the Towelket series. To progress, the Moon Princess has promised to revive us, but only after a series of boss fights to absolve us of our sins. Reincarnated Umebuta-kun is pretty easy, but the next two fights against the Moon Deities and Moon Princess are back-to-back and can be a bit tricky. If Pucchi didn't die, then the fight becomes much more difficult as you'll be missing a party member and you won't have much in terms of healing. Expect to get water poisoning from all the bath water you'll chug to get through this fight, as it's likely going to be the longest one so far. After finally defeating the Moon Princess, our party is finally revived into their original bodies once again. Cliché's original form, however, isn't just a log of wood, but instead the god of vegetables, who decides to stay behind in the Moon Princess's realm to send the protagonist's souls back to where they belong. Kachil wakes up back in his body on Earth. And Conchel and the groom have a touching reunion. Unfortunately, this means that we'll lose Cliché as a party member for the rest of the game. I'll miss that little guy, but at least we have the Dust Chief. So, after literally dying and coming back from death, it feels like the climax of the story. But here's where the game reminds you that no, it's really just the halfway point of the game. We're reminded about the other two planets taken over by the Fish Hats, Aquastar and Firestar, and the team decides to split up to liberate both of them. This is where Towelket 3 feels like it has some pacing issues. The whole reincarnation space felt like such a great build-up into something greater, and now we're back to goofy RPG adventures, so this is where some people might feel like the game is dragging out a bit. It is good that we're making sure that there aren't loose ends, but admittedly it is a step down from what we just experienced. Aquastar comes up first, and it's an ocean planet where the Kisetsu are polluting the water and using it for breeding more Kisetsu snakes. The current ruler of Aquastar, Oshikana-sama, is helpless, as he's a giant fish who would die in the polluted waters. Not only that, but his daughter, the princess, has been captured as well. There are little water drop guys, and we also make friends with a cloud guy who carries Conchal down to the surface. There's also this funny section where you're all tiny. The best part is when you find Umebutsu-kun is reincarnated and there's this extremely touching music playing as he promises to help you, as if two long-lost lovers have reunited. As we progress through Aquastar, we get a cutscene where the fish hat in charge of Aquastar, Elegy, is trying to date the princess of Aquastar, Undini, or Undi? Instead of being a genocidal maniac like Himiola, he's just a himbo instead, which is only slightly worse. He's not making much progress though, so he calls Habanera, the fish hat on Earth, to help him. He asks her to find him an orchestra and a singer to perform music for his date. She's too busy, so she sends over her boy toy slave Pian to go do it instead. Yeah, remember him? This guy? We get a short section where we play as Pian and a Kisetsu alien. We first beat up the bug orchestra again, which is easy with the overpowered magic we have. Then we make our way back to Sewer Town where we find Pari Pari Ume, who has dressed the protagonist up as a bug. Mistaking the two for singers, Pian takes them prisoner and sends them to Aquastar, where they're forced to perform for Elegy's strange date. Conchal breaks into the room soon after though, resulting in a boss battle against Elegy. Elegy buffs himself up a lot, so he can actually be pretty dangerous if you let him stack attack and defense. Using poison and the Groom Sleep move, then blasting him with spells will help a lot. After you beat him up, Aquastar is saved and Cachil is back to being relevant, although he hasn't reunited with his sister yet. Speaking of his sister, the game then goes to Kimiru's point of view. Firestar is inhabited by candle people and octopus people, who the Kisetsu are melting and turning into takoyaki respectively. The fish hats have taken away the fire from Firestar, sending it into darkness. We get the help of the Aroma Chief, leader of Firestar. He ignites himself to give us a light and go on to save another planet. And then 2 minutes later, the Aroma Chief melts and dies as you reach the fish hat ship. Story-wise, Firestar is a lot simpler, but combat here can actually be pretty annoying. You're stuck with Nekoashi Kanbu and Nekozuken, who are probably undergeared and underleveled unless if you went out of your way to upgrade them. When you enter the fish hat ship, Kimiru gets locked behind a door, leaving you with what could be two of your weakest characters. It's not hard to avoid combat thankfully, since all of the enemies can be walked around, but it does make this section less fun. The two cats confront the fish hat leader, Ariere, whose only defining personality trait is that she likes bathing. As expected, the two are no match for her, but while Kimiru was trapped, she was making friends with a captive fire dragon called Cassie. The two break out of their prison and the boss fight with Ariere starts. Cassie isn't a party member, but instead a summon spell for Kimiru, who is thankfully pretty useful at mopping up all of the enemies that appear during this fight. Ariere on her own is pretty weak, so just beat her down and Firestar is saved. Once we're done with Firestar, there's one last dungeon before the final stretch of the game, the liberation of Pawn Town on Earth. Because the Kisetsu aliens have fortified their security on Earth so much, however, the party needs to be turned into electricity and sent to Earth through a virtual themed zone. Usually when you see a virtual themed area in a game, it'll be like 8-bit graphics or maybe just have a really cybernetic theme. But here we're going even further past that to like the 1970s to early 1980s consoles or home computers. This is definitely a little bit before my time. It's also got the best music in the game. We talked to some friendly computer bits and learned that the Kisetsu are taking over even the virtual world. The Kisetsu have infested the electrical world with a virus, which is causing all of the people to malfunction and freeze. After taking out the virus, we pop out of a weird robot resembling Kimiru back at our house. We can explore the area around our home, finding out that the Kisetsu have taken over pretty much everything. We fight our way back to Sewer Town before traveling back to Pond Town, where we can confront Habanera. First, we'll have to beat up Pian, who is surprisingly tough for a little kid, and then Habanera, making this a bit of an endurance fight. Habanera is mostly straightforward, but she loves spamming attacks that trip your party, which can make the fight a huge pain if she happens to stunlock your party repeatedly. It shouldn't be too much trouble for you at this point, though. Once Habanera is defeated, Poppichi lands the pawn battleship, and we're given one last opportunity to prepare before the final battle now that we have the whole solar system on our side. You can freely fly around most of the game world and check out the planets you've saved and such, although there isn't much to do. It's really just nice to see how the planets are recovering. You can even go all the way back to Dust Town, and they're talking about fighting the Kisetsu aliens with you. The Woodstar people still have people impaled on spikes though, so I can only assume that's normal for them. You'll also want to gear up your party a bit. At the very least, it's a good idea to go back into the mine and get all the equipment you can. You can also recruit Pian, who's broken free from brainwashing, but he sucks, so who cares. Once we're done, we can go towards the point of no return to the final battle. We get a little romantic scene with Cont and a motivational speech from Pongroom, who talks to everyone we've rescued. He also says he'll marry Cont after we win. Huh, that seems a little weird considering a romantic moment. Once we enter the final battle, we fly towards the Kisetsu capital ship, fighting Kisetsu starfighters before landing on the ship itself. Now, here's something interesting. Do you see those two things that are half off the screen? Those two things are actually stores, and one of them sells you some of the best equipment in the game that's going to be super useful for the final boss. It's not quite in secret territory, since you might notice the platform it's in and climb upwards, but I know of some people who accidentally passed by it and had trouble with the final boss. Spoilers, the final boss is pretty hard, so you'll want to buy some equipment from this store. In particular, the Love Lips collar accessory is one of the best things you can get, so I hope you had some money saved up. It's also worth going into your skill tree and getting the group sleep spell and stocking up on dread bombs too. On the way over to the final boss, we first encounter Seller once again, the fish hat who was killed by Nekozuken and Kimiru. She's been revived through some sort of life support system, although clearly she's not quite herself. It seems that after she died, her husband, Zuche, tried to revive her to bring her back from the dead, but she didn't come back right. She's still in our way and we're forced to fight her though. Her life support machines heal and buff her, while she debuffs your attack stat, so this fight can go on pretty long if you aren't prepared. If you don't use poison in this fight, or have good spells to ignore her stat changes, you might end up hitting her for only single target damage, making this fight take horrendously long. Finally, after our long adventure, we confront Zuche, who hardly even gives a speech before attacking us. This first fight is deceptively simple, as Zuche doesn't really have many tricks other than some beefy stats. However, this is just to fool you into a false sense of security. After you beat his first fight, a new battle is started where you have to fight off against his second form. This final phase is a huge difficulty spike, and if you've been underestimating the game's difficulty, then this fight can definitely catch you off guard, as it's easily the hardest fight in the game. Zuche summons all of the fish hats of all of the previous leaders for one big boss battle, and all 6 of them will immediately start blasting your party with magic damage of all elements. This is why that Love Lips collar is so helpful, as it's one of the only things that will prevent you from taking too much damage. You also aren't healed between fights, so if your party is too slow and you're hurt from the last fight, it's possible to get wiped out on the first turn. The fish hats also just aren't weak minions. They have a decent amount of HP too, so bursting them down first is difficult. Thankfully, The fish hats and even Zuche himself are still vulnerable to status ailments, so start off by using group-wide status effects like sleep or fear to stun the fish hats before you buff up and finish them off. The magic defense skill can also reduce their elemental damage, and combined with a Love Lips collar, they might not be able to hurt you at all. They all have a ton of HP, but once you've set up properly, you should be able to whittle them down to a victory. After an arduous battle, we come out victorious, but not before Zuche has one more trick up his sleeve. He activates a self-destruct system and forces us to escape before the ship blows up. We find the conveniently located escape pod, but the door to get inside is too hot to open. Thankfully, we have the final, remaining piece of the Towelket to open the door, although the poor thing is melted into a blob from the heat. Kimiru tosses it away and we get in the escape pod as the ship explodes. As we're speeding off, we find out that Zuche has survived and he also plans to escape. As he tries to leave, he steps into the melted Towelket, making it relevant one more time. He's glued to the spot and gets caught in the explosion, defeated by the titular Towelket. After barely surviving the explosion, we find ourselves waking up back at Pond Town, where the groom is getting married to Cont, although it really just ends up being an extra convincing robot made by Poppichi. We have a final chance to talk to all the characters we met along the way. Depending on Pucci's state, she says she'll either be returning back to her satellite or to the Moon Princess's realm. And we can have another heartwarming moment with Cont. Once we've had our fun talking to everyone, we finally get all of the shrunken humans in front of the magic book, and Nekoashi Kanbu returns everyone back to their normal size. Kimiru and Kechil reunite with their mother, and we get a charming epilogue sequence showing what happened to all the characters. A happy ending for everyone. So what can you say about Towelket 3? Well, it's a very charming and cheerful RPG adventure, designed as a fairly straightforward RPG game, but with the humor of someone who might just be a little perverted, and it's clear that Kanao had a lot of fun making this. The cast of characters, the environments, and the writing are all unique in a way that I think makes the game enjoyable to play. However, at the same time, I can see why this game wasn't particularly good at hooking players into the Towelket series, and likely contributed towards the series being quite a bit more obscure. First off, this game has a lot of focus on RPG gameplay, and while that's honestly not a bad thing, a lot of the most popular RPG Maker games tend not to have a focus on gameplay, instead focusing on narrative stories. If someone claimed that they were an RPG Maker fan, chances are they wouldn't really like Towelket 3 because of its focus on battles. However, its RPG gameplay isn't complex enough to be appealing as a hardcore RPG game. Towelket 3 essentially hits a perfect middle ground where it's not combat focused enough for people who love RPG combat, but it's too combat focused for people who love RPG stories. Yes, there's a story in Towelket 3, but it's not a particularly strong story with deep narrative elements. You go to lots of fantastical, memorable worlds and see lots of crazy things, but the general plotline could be simplified to just a bunch of kids are swept up into a crazy adventure and need to beat up the bad guys. Furthermore, there's no doubt that the perverted humor in this game could be hit or miss. There's quite a lot of it, and while I personally found myself chuckling over it, I could easily see it being too much for some people. So, would I personally recommend Towelket 3 one more time? Personally for me, I found it a fun, memorable game that still resides in my head to this day just because of how creative and wacky it is. I was actually able to write a good amount of this script just from memory, which I think is good proof on how unique and memorable the game is. Now, if you really find the humor, especially the perverted stuff, hilarious, then I could see this game being extremely fun to play. On the other hand, if you were really looking for a game with a deep and compelling story, this game could be pretty disappointing. And if you found the gameplay bad, it might honestly be insultingly bad. For me personally, I think I'd give it a B tier ranking, as I think it's fun and worth checking out, but it's definitely not as good as a lot of the later Towelket games. But now, this isn't the full picture, because as I said near the beginning of this review, there's not just one version of Towelket 3, but 3 versions of Towelket 3. I'll quickly go over them here, because I definitely think they're worth mentioning. To start with, the original Towelket 3, also known by fans as Towelket 3 Classic, is actually a pretty interesting game in itself. It's unfortunately not translated by the team who has translated other Towelket games, but it has a pretty good machine translation. The first thing you can notice right off the bat is the art style of the game, which is quite different from Karage. I actually really love the art in this game, and I think it just oozes soul. The characters look a little scuffed sometimes, admittedly, and the pawns resemble creepy bald uncles, but the environments in this game are just gorgeous. Places like Sewer Town especially have way more character, with tons of details in the environment. Not only that, but there's more custom battle animations in combat. Compared to Karage, I think this game is more visually appealing. The gameplay is fairly similar, although admittedly less refined. Combat in the early game is harder, with a lot of the early game maps throwing tons of enemies at you. However, the scaling of your party is pretty out of whack, especially if you go out of your way to get optional equipment. There's also a good bit more backtracking. For example, to get the gas mask to enter the sewer, you actually have to run all the way back to the dust chief who gives you the gas mask, rather than just being able to buy it in the same town. The story follows the same plot, although there are some notable story beat differences. For example, Pucchi is just a prisoner of the Kisetsu rather than a pet of cliché, and instead of Nekozuken, there's a dog wearing a fish hat named Inuashi Konbu. The writing is also much more innocent, with a lot of the perverted humor removed. There's still some oddities here or there, like the weird eye thing, so you still wouldn't want to give this to a kid, but you aren't constantly reminded about the pawn groom's preferences in girls. The biggest difference by far, however, is that instead of 6 fish hats, there's only 3: Zuche, Himiola, and Habanera. This means that major sections of the game, namely Aquastar and Firestar, are absent. On one hand, this actually sort of improves the pacing of the game, but it also makes it feel incomplete compared to Karage. Not only that, but the end of the game is clearly rushed and feels a little incomplete. The final stretch of the game is oddly empty and lacking detail compared to the rich environments at the start. You can also unintentionally find your way to the unfinished Firestar and Aquastar maps as proof that they were planned. I actually don't know why the game released in this state, as I can't find archive records about it, but I suspect that it might have been part of a contest, as Canal was submitting RPG games to contests early in their dev career. It's possible that they simply didn't have enough time to meet the contest deadline and had to release the game in this state. Unfortunately, Canal was an extremely obscure developer at this time, so archive records of what happened at this point don't exist as far as I'm aware. Because of that, while I do think the visual aspects of Classic are really appealing, and the game is a great example of a soulful, high-effort game made by a solo developer, it is a little hard to recommend over Karage, which I have to assume was Kanao trying to finish the game they originally started on. At the very least, I think that this game is probably potentially less offensive than Karage, both in terms of its writing, and it also doesn't drag on for as long if the game is getting a bit boring for the player. If it ever gets a proper English translation, then I wouldn't feel bad recommending this version at all, especially if you wanted something easier to digest. Maybe in the future I could do a video of this version if it's in demand. Lastly, we have the third version of Towelket 3, commonly referred to as Towelket 3 MV, as this game was made in the RPG Maker MV engine. This remake is honestly incredibly fun, expanding upon Karage greatly. The first most notable aspect is that the game is much longer, easily about 3 times as long. There's tons of flavor text added in writing that makes the game a lot more fun, and tons of great jokes in this game. Even minor characters get lots of new dialogue that's genuinely funny. Even though the main plotline is the same and still isn't particularly amazing, it does expand the story in a way that makes it more interesting as well. For example, it expands on the lore regarding the fish hats and the D-series robots. However, the most notable aspect of Towelket 3 MV is the gameplay, which is absolutely insane. This game is way harder than Karage, and is easily the hardest game in the Towelket series. Enemies in this game are absolutely brutal and will pummel your party to death in seconds. However, there's a catch. Every party member you collect over the course of your game will join you in combat, and a ton of minor characters in Karage are now full-blown playable party members in this game. Whenever one of your characters dies in combat, they'll almost immediately be replaced by someone else in your backline, causing a ridiculous style of gameplay where you just overwhelm the enemy with your ginormous party. I can only describe this as human wave-style tactics the RPG, and it's honestly a lot of fun. I would love to review this game now, but the biggest issue with Towelket 3 MV is that it contains a lot of references to other Towelket games, including characters from later games. Now, the story is self-contained, so it doesn't really matter, but since it's sort of a love letter to Towelket as a series, I think it's better off saved for later. Furthermore, the art style of this game is really all over the place, and there's a weird mix of new art and old 2000s art that really looks off. So while I can't recommend it as your first Towelket game, I feel like it's worth playing just because the combat is really unique. I'd definitely love to make a video dedicated to this version of the game sometime in the future, so I'll hold off on giving it a rating for now. So with that, I finally finished my retrospective on Towelket 3. It's certainly an interesting game, and I think that for the first game in the series and one of the earliest games made by Kanao, it's very impressive. A lot of work clearly went into it, and I can respect it as a starting point for the series. However, it's not really the best example of what the series would eventually be known for, as Kanao's writing style would develop, and not only would we see more unique settings, like in Towelket 3, but also truly unique stories. For that, we'll have to move on to Towelket 2, the next game in the series. Towelket 2 is certainly where many fans would say the series really started to gain its identity for having strong story elements you wouldn't see elsewhere. I would sincerely recommend playing it for yourself after watching this video, as unlike Towelket 3, its story is serious enough where I think spoilers will actually matter. If you aren't sold on it or aren't sure, then I certainly plan on making another video for Towelket 2 in the future. It'll take me a while, so if you sincerely like my content, then I ask that you subscribe or toggle notifications so that you can see it once it comes out. This is also my first time making a video like this, so if there's anything you'd like to see me do, or if you have any feedback, I'd greatly appreciate any of it in the comments below. I'd also love to hear your opinions on Towelket 3 as well if you have any. Thank you very much for getting this far in the video, and I hope you enjoyed this retrospective on Towelket 3. Please look forward to Towelket 2 next, the game that really gave this series a foothold in the RPG maker space and gave it a cult following in Japan. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.